Hello YouTube, this is Kiryu904, and here I present to you my very first movie review. Okay, for my first movie review, I'll be taking a look at the 1989 underwater science fiction film, The Abyss, which was written and directed by James Cameron. Before we go on, I just want to inform everyone watching that this review will contain spoilers. Alright, let's start off with the plot. The film begins with this U.S. nuclear missile submarine, the USS Montana, which sinks into the Cayman Trough after it encounters an unidentified object. And then later we see that the U.S. Navy plans to use this experimental underwater oil drilling platform called Deep Core and its crew to reach the location of the downed sub. They also send in a Navy SEAL team to supervise the mission, and this woman named Lindsay Brigman decides to accompany them, since she's the platform's designer and chief engineer. Once they've all transferred down, Lindsay meets up with Deep Core's foreman, Virgil Bud Brigman. It turns out that the two are an estranged couple who had previously worked together on the rig, and they argue about Deep Core as well as their past relationship. When they finally arrive at their destination, the rig crew and the SEALs head out and search through the Montana for any survivors, but they discover that pretty much the entire personnel is dead. However, before they return, Lindsay spots this brightly glowing object that zips around the sub that she's in before it shoots down into the trench. Back aboard Deep Core, the SEAL team leader, Lieutenant Coffey, is reporting what Lindsay saw to his superiors, who are on the platform support ship, the Benthic Explorer. And he tells them that he thinks it might have been Russian, because, this takes place during the Cold War. Then he's ordered to retrieve a warhead from one of the submarine's missiles. The SEALs proceed to take one of the mini-subs, which is used for unhooking the platform from the cable connecting them from the Explorer, and the crew try to stop them from doing this since there's a hurricane headed towards them, but they're too late. After 2 hours, the SEAL team finally gets back, and one of the rig crew gets to work on detaching Deep Core from the ship, but by now the storm has arrived, which rocks both the Explorer and the cable back and forth, making this task difficult to accomplish. Eventually, the ship gets swung out of position and starts dragging the platform towards the edge of the trench. The crane on board the ship which holds the cable then gets snapped off and lands underwater next to Deep Core, where it starts to fall into the trench, pulling the rig even closer to the edge. Fortunately, they stop just before going over, but the rig is badly damaged to the point where it's partially flooded, and they lose all communication with the Explorer. And then later, after assessing some of the damage to the platform, Lindsay goes outside in order to extend their oxygen supply, and encounters the glowing object again, along with an even bigger one. And as they both swim away, she manages to get a few pictures of the smaller one. She then shows them to the rest of the crew and tries to tell them that there's a non-terrestrial intelligence residing within the trench, or NTIs for short, as they're later called. She also attempts to convince Bud about this, but he doesn't believe her. Later on, the NTIs create this water tentacle and use it to observe and communicate with the rig crew, and they're pretty amazed by this. Unfortunately, Coffey, having developed high-pressure nervous syndrome since he arrived on Deep Core, also sees it, gets freaked out, and closes the door on it, which causes it to retreat. And then later, he takes the nuke that his team recovered from the Montana and attaches it to one of the rig's ROVs that Lindsay and another crew member had set up earlier to get some footage of the NTIs in the trench, and decides to send it down there and blow them all up. The crew later find out about this and try to stop him, but he escapes in one of the mini-subs with the ROV and the nuke. Bud goes after him in diving gear and ties the ROV to the rig with a rope, which prevents it from descending into the trench. However, Coffey starts to chase after him, but Lindsay manages to rescue him in another mini-sub. Then, the rope attached to the attached to the ROV begins to loosen, but Bud and Lindsay catch it in time. Unfortunately, Coffee slams his sub into theirs, causing them to let go of the rope, and the ROV goes down into the trench. He then chases them and tries to wreck their sub, but they manage to get the drop on him, and both subs end up crashing near the edge of the trench. Eventually, the sub that Coffee's in falls over the edge, and the rapidly increasing pressure causes it to implode, which kills him instantly. After that, the mini-sub that Bud and Lindsay are in starts to fill with water due to the damage it took, and since they only have one diving suit, Lindsay decides to drown herself and have Bud haul her back to the rig where she can be resuscitated, and he reluctantly agrees. He then makes it back to Deep Core with Lindsay in tow, where the crew have some difficulty reviving her, but they succeed in the end. And then later, Bud decides to travel down into the trench in order to locate the ROV and disarm the nuke attached to it. And he also wears this special diving suit that the SEALs brought with them, which is equipped with this fluid breathing system so that he can operate in the intense pressure below, as well as a keypad so he can type out messages in order to communicate with the crew back on the rig. After he's all prepped, Bud begins to descend into the trench, and after 30 minutes, he finally reaches the ROV. Then, with guidance from one of the SEALs, he successfully disables the nuke. Unfortunately, he informs the crew that he only has 5 minutes worth of oxygen left, much to the dismay of Lindsay. Bud then sends her one last message saying that he pretty much knew that he wouldn't be able to make it back, and also that he loves her. A little bit after that though, one of the NTIs finds him before he runs out of oxygen, and he's brought back to their main ship, where they give him a fresh supply of air, and he meets more of the NTIs on board. Meanwhile, back on the surface, the storm finally clears up, and the Explorer manages to re-establish communication with Deep Core. And then, much to the surprise and joy of the crew, they receive another message from Bud telling them that he's alive, and that he's made contact with the NTIs. The main NTI ship then begins to rise up from the ocean, bringing the rig along with it, and it soon reaches the surface while also catching the Explorer and a few naval ships. After that, everyone on Deep Core exits to look around at the huge vessel when they spot Bud coming out of the ship's entrance. Lindsay walks over to him and they greet each other. Then they share a kiss together, thus reaffirming their love for one another. And that is where the film ends. And that was The Abyss. While not majorly fantastic, it is a pretty good movie. The story is good. All of the characters were acted out very well. The protagonists, like Bud and Lindsay, were pretty likable, and Coffee was good as the antagonist. Most of the practical effects throughout the film, such as the miniatures and the full-size sets, looked pretty good as far as 1980s practical effects go. The early CGI effects used for the water tentacle looked very nice, and I thought it was done quite well. I did like the design of the NTIs and their technology. I thought they looked very interesting. The soundtrack, which was composed by Alan Silvestri, sounded great, and I enjoyed listening to it. There was also a special edition of this film that was made and released in 1993, which reinserted some scenes that were originally cut from the theatrical version. There were a few in there that I liked, which included some that featured more interactions among the rig crew, and also this other one which came after the water tentacle scene, where they talk about the possible origins of the NTIs, like did they come from space or underwater. So those were the extra scenes I enjoyed, and then there were scenes which I felt didn't really need to be added back in. In the theatrical version, there was tension built up between the Deep Core crew and Lieutenant Coffee, and some of the restored scenes showed us the further growth of this tension, but they were a bit unnecessary to me. So yeah, those are the scenes that I think didn't really need to be included in the special edition. There There is one more scene in this version which was extended with additional footage that I'll give my thoughts on, and it's the part where Bud is brought on board the main NTI ship. After they give him fresh air, the NTI show him that they're able to monitor TV broadcasts, and that they've also begun to form 1,000-foot-high tidal waves along the shores of every continent. And Bud asks, "Why are you doing this?" And then they start displaying footage of all these nuclear tests, and after that all kinds of war footage, which is basically their way of telling him that humanity has become too violent and self-destructive, so we're gonna wipe them out. But just before all the waves come crashing down, they suddenly stop and remain in this fixed position before they all recede back into the ocean. And then Bud's like, "Why didn't you do it?" And they replay his last message that he sent to Lindsay, which is their way of saying, "We've decided to spare mankind since we now see that they're capable of love and altruism and not just violence." This part seemed kind of cliched, in my opinion, although I thought the effects for the waves looked good. Okay, that's all I've got to say about the special edition. It was pretty good. It had some extra scenes that I enjoyed, and only had a few that I thought were unnecessary. I'm not quite sure which version of this film I prefer, though. Alright, so those are all of my thoughts on The Abyss. It's an entertaining science fiction movie. It has a good story, good characters, effects which range from okay to pretty good, great soundtrack, and it had good moments of suspense and drama. If you enjoy James Cameron movies or sci-fi movies, you might like this one. Well, I hope you all enjoy my first movie review. Goodbye, and have a good day, everyone.